attacks which killed more than 50 people and injured dozens.
Indonesia states that 3 Islamic militants convicted for their roles in the deadly Malik bin Walid.
Controversially, he found some of them not guilty. I say it's controversial because
from Aldgate reiterating what we're now being told by Scotland Yard that this is
Markets around the city. The pain and trauma of what happened on Saturday has filled Delhi residents with terror.
well, what I'm seeing is a lot of very, very frightened people, as you know.
In the year 610 AD, on a rocky mountain overlooking Mecca, a 40-year-old man named Muhammad was reflecting on the purpose of life. After years of deep thinking and meditation, he began to receive divine revelation.
The revelations that he received is called the Quran, a divine book which came from the same source as the Torah sent to Moses and the Gospel which was given to Jesus Christ.
The relationship between the Quran and the previous revelations is that of a clarifier and explainer. The Quran comes from the same source as is illustrated in the Quran and even in those previous revelations that prophesied the coming of Muhammad and the Quran itself.
To this day, the Quran continues to be the key source of guidance for billions of followers. People from all walks of life adopt the way of the Quran through the example of Muhammad.
Because of the profound and holistic nature of the Quranic text, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had the task of explaining it to his followers and his companions. And these explanations of Prophet Muhammad are compiled in what's known as the Sunnah.
The relationship between the Quran and Sunnah is a relationship of paints to a brush. The Quran brings universal, general colors which are painted in the lives and hearts of people by the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So the Quran orders us to pray, it orders us to fast, it orders us to pray charity, and the Quran even mentions fighting in the cause of God. All of those are depicted and illustrated by the Sunnah, which paints those general universals into the lives of people.
The Sunnah provides guidelines needed by humanity for any issues that one may face. From fine aspects of life like basic daily activities, such as matters of health and hygiene, to the forming and running of a government. What became the most controversial of all these teachings is a concept known as jihad. In today's world, people from a wide range of cultures have different understandings about the term jihad.
The word jihad comes from the Arabic root jahada, which means doing extra effort. So linguistically, the word jihad, we can say that it means striving and struggling.
The word jihad in the Muslim world actually carries with it a very positive connotation. I have a number of friends in Egypt as well as other countries. Their names are jihad. I even know some small beautiful girls with rosy apple cheeks. Their names are jihad. And even when you go to take an exam, for example here, and you're struggling, they'll tell you make jihad. So the word jihad actually for the majority of Muslims carries with it the sense of struggle and strife against oneself in order to improve their lot and draw nearer to God.
Islamically, it has three meanings or levels. The first one is spiritual jihad, inner struggle against evil inclinations and the pursuit of self-purification and life of virtue.
You struggle against your own ego, against your inclinations, your evil inclinations, and your desires to live a better life and to attain sincerity.
It encompasses every aspect of the person's life, from being good to one's wife or husband, being good to one's children, kind to one's neighbor, speaking the truth in front of the oppressor, waking up and praying in the middle of the night. All of this is encompassed under that internal drive, that hard drive that pushes the Muslim, which is called spiritual jihad.
One of the aspects of Islam is charity. When Muslims give charity, they're supposed to keep this between them and their Creator and not to tell anybody. This is to stop them from showing off. It's very difficult not to tell anybody. For this, you need jihad.
Prophet Muhammad promised paradise for the person who spends in charity with the right hand while the left hand is unaware of it, which is a metaphor for spending in charity secretly with sincerity in order to protect the integrity of one's intention.
The poor people of Medina were receiving supplies to their doors at the darkness of the night, and they did not discover who was bringing them until he passed away. And that was Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin, the great-grandson of Prophet Muhammad. Until this day, many Muslims are following the footsteps of those great early Muslims.
So profound is that experience that we find countless examples of American Muslims and Western Muslims and Muslims the world over engaged in sacrifice, such selfless sacrifice to help others. In America, during the Katrina hurricane, I remember when I went to Houston, Texas, before the government had agreed to subsidize people, a Muslim man had donated his hotel, free rooms for victims of the Hurricane Katrina. That all falls under that massive mechanism known as jihad al-nafs, or spiritual jihad.
The second meaning of jihad is verbal jihad, which is saying the truth, even if it's against one's interests. In some countries, when people say the truth, they can end up in jail.
In many countries around the world, saying the truth is a big risk to one's freedom or even one's life. Standing for justice and saying the truth is considered verbal jihad.
What is the position of Islam on this point? Does Islam tell you to keep quiet, to be safe? No. Islam tells you to stand up for the truth, enjoin what's good and forbid what is evil, even if you are risking your life. Because we all have to die, and it is better to die with dignity so that future generations will benefit.
Civil rights activists who speak against tyranny and oppression are actually performing verbal jihad, which actually has a big impact on the reform of any society. And this is encouraged by Prophet Muhammad in many statements.
He said, "The best form of jihad is the word of truth in the presence of a tyrant."
Throughout history, the greatest instrument of change has not been weapons, nuclear bombs, guns, murder, harming people. The greatest weapon of change has been the tongue. Throughout history, how many societies, how many people's lives have been impacted by someone who had the courage and the willpower to rise up and speak the truth? For that reason, Islam considers speaking the truth as one of the greatest forms of struggle. And it is in that light, if we look at our own history, that we've seen without the tongue, there would have been no change. Where would the civil rights movement be if Martin Luther King had never stood up and said, "Let freedom ring, let freedom ring"? In that same pulse, the Muslims are encouraged to stand up and say, "Let freedom ring, let the truth ring," and speak to power and oppression.
However, when the word jihad is mentioned in non-Muslim societies, it is not the spiritual nor the verbal type that comes to people's minds. It is the third meaning that causes great concern. This is combative jihad.
Combative jihad is definitely the type of jihad which has caused the concept itself of jihad to be by far the most misunderstood Islamic concept. That's why we have to focus a lot on this type of jihad the combative jihad, and explain the reality of it to both Muslims and non-Muslims.
Combative jihad has to be the most misunderstood subject within the Muslim world and outside of the Muslim world. And I think that's due to a number of reasons. Number one is that people fail to realize that the majority of rulings that surround combative jihad came from the works of legal scholars and judges throughout history. The Quran and Sunnah laid down universals for combat, but those universals were dictated, understood, and defined over time. So what might have been fitting for a certain age is not necessarily fitting for this age. Number two is the actions of Muslims themselves, those Muslims who have taken upon themselves to act without any regard for human life, without respecting those principles laid down by the Quran and Sunnah and by Islam itself, and have actually done more to harm the religion and Muslims than to help them. Number three is the ignorance of the media and the ignorance of the people in general about Islam. I have a very good friend who works for CNN, and I asked her one time, does the media hate Muslims? Does the media have problems with Muslims? She said, no, they don't know Muslims. Muslims are not out there actively engaging them and teaching them about their religion. So I think those are three very important factors. And the fourth would be a long history of problems between the West and the East that really hasn't come to boil since recently with the explosion of communications, the internet, and so on. Those four things have really led to a misunderstanding of jihad.
Use of the word jihad has changed dramatically. During the 1980s, mainstream media labeled the mujahideen, or jihadists, as freedom fighters. Less than 2 decades later, media outlets are distorting the meaning of jihad to describe terrorists.
On the 24th of December 1979, the first divisions of the Soviet armed forces crossed the Amu Darya River, invading Afghanistan.
This is a callous violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. It is a deliberate effort of a powerful atheistic government to subjugate an independent Islamic people.
Jihad was now declared against the Soviet Union. In Kandahar, 4,500 mujahideen waged war against 11,000 Soviet and Afghan army troops.
Because of the abuse of the word jihad by the media and by politicians, the word jihad became very negative in the West. Actually, it scares people, it makes people panic, to the extent that some young people who were arrested for having some engagement in violence were indicted, and their indictments were that they are planning to do jihad. And this reflects a very poor understanding of the word. In fact, not only the word jihad was misused, many words were used contrary to their meanings. For example, the word crusade. The word crusade means struggle against public evil, but because it was used to describe waves of destructors and bloody wars, now it has a very negative connotation. When people hear the word crusade, the only thing that jumps to their minds is greed, destruction, occupation. That's why it is our role now to go out to the whole world and explain the reality of the concept of jihad.
The definition of terrorism has been contentious for many years. In September 2005, 150 world leaders met at the United Nations to define terrorism. But after 2 days, the summit ended without agreeing upon a definition. It is a different case in the academic community, where many scholars of political sciences and professors of international law have a clear definition of terrorism. Robert Pape, an American political science professor at Chicago University, has written 2 books on terrorism, Dying to Win and Bombing to Win.
Terrorism, from my point of view, is probably the ordinary use of the word terrorism, which is the killing of innocents for a political cause. By killing innocents, I mean civilians or off-duty policemen. By a political cause, I mean getting the intention to get those people to change their political behavior. Say, surrender a piece of territory that they're holding on to, or to otherwise change their form of government.
Philippe Sands, a professor of international law at the University College of London and also the author of two important books, Lawless World and Torture Team.
I think my general understanding of terrorism is that it is an act which is intended to instill fear in the population of civilians. That's the essential difference between a lawful act and an unlawful act. And lawful act in times of armed conflict basically says you can target military operations. What you can never do is target civilians. And once you start intentionally targeting civilians, you cross a line into illegality, into criminality, and in some cases, depending on the nature of the act, its extent, its purpose, its design, you cross a line from ordinary criminality into terrorism. But drawing those lines is never easy.
So, if targeting non-combatants in order to force a political agenda is the clear definition of terrorism, then why is it that the United Nations Summit failed to define it as such?
Whenever I hear that there's a discrepancy with how the UN or another political body has defined terrorism versus how scholars tend to define terrorism, what I think immediately is that politics have come into the issue. That is, that states are essentially trying to defend what they believe are their own national interests and not wanting to agree to a definition in which someone could claim, oh, you violated the norm. And so what I think is happening is that we shouldn't really be expecting a political body such as the UN to come together to have a clean definition of terrorism.
Gunnar Westberg, a Swedish doctor and co-president of the Nobel Peace Prize winning International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Well, everybody knows what terrorism is, but they know different things. So they couldn't agree. Some of the countries wanted state repression against political groups as terrorists, to be called terrorists. Others did not want that. So because of this disagreement, they couldn't sign any document.
They did not fail to define terrorism, but rather they did not want to, for this would be an indictment on many of them.
Governments have been trying to define terrorism for 50 years, and every time they get to a point where there will be disagreement, because one person's act, which might be characterized in the eyes of some as an act to stop oppression or colonialism or apartheid or discrimination, and which is an act in order to free that particular person, will be seen by another person as a terrorist act. And of course there is also the question of whether or not acts of war and wanton violence, when large numbers of people are killed by attacks in various parts of the world using very sophisticated military means, have consequences which are, in the eyes of some, analogous to terrorist acts. So states, I think, are never going to agree. What states can agree on, if they can't agree on what terrorism is they can agree, and they have agreed, that there are certain things that no one can do in any circumstances. You can never target civilians. That is the golden central rule. Once you cross that line, once you break that rule, you expose yourself to the risk of criminal responsibility.
Throughout the past 2 decades, there has been a growing trend of connecting Muslim people to terrorism. Increasingly, after an act of terrorism, the default reaction around the world has been to suspect Muslim people.
There is a number of erroneous statements that are often made by people in the media in the West. One is to say that not all Muslims are terrorists, we agree, but all terrorists are Muslims. This is a very misleading statement, and factually it is not correct. Muslims, even those who deviate from Islam, who committed acts of terror, were not the first to do it, nor the majority of people who got involved in this kind of operations.
Not just Muslims are terrorists. There are Christian terrorists, there are secular terrorists, there are Jewish terrorists, there are Muslim terrorists, there are Hindu terrorists, and of course there are many, many more of all of those people and all sorts of other people who are not terrorists. It's a very simplistic approach, I suppose, that I'm taking, but it would be quite wrong to ascribe the category of terrorist to any particular group at any point ever. That would be quite wrong.
Terrorism has been there for an enormously long time, and I think it will always be there. And I don't even see that Muslims are the main perpetrators, if we look at the world. Hindus are doing an enormous amount of terrorists, for instance. And in Europe, we had all kinds of political groups who strongly influenced the politics of the country through their violent acts.
Terrorism goes back since time immemorial, as defined, as I've defined it, or as even the 1997 Convention defines it. We have examples in Britain. I grew up as a child in London when my mother wouldn't allow me to go shopping in the centre of town because a group known as the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, who happened to be Catholics, were bombing the centre of London. Those were terrorist acts. We know that in the 1940s in Palestine and what is now Israel, Jewish groups used terrorist methods to instill fear in a local population and against the British. Terrorism is not a discriminatory concept. Terrorism doesn't look at a person's ethnicity, identity, or nationality.
Well, it's absurd to think that only Muslim people can be terrorists. Terrorism is not gender, it is not nationality, it is surely not religion. There are Christians who commit terrorist acts, there are Hindus who commit terrorist acts, there are Jews who commit terrorist acts. Terrorism, again, it has, its definition has nothing to do with those kinds of things.
In 1994, Baruch Goldstein killed 29 Muslims and injured more than 150 others while they were prostrating in prayer at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Palestine. Goldstein was a New York-born Jewish Israeli and a member of the Jewish Defense League, a militant Jewish organization founded by Rabbi Meir Kahana. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh, a member of the Oklahoma-based Christian group Elohim City, bombed an office complex in downtown Oklahoma, killing at least 168 Americans and injuring nearly 700. Elohim City established its church in the 1950s and was most frequented by members of the Christian Identity, a group that believed that non-Caucasian people have no souls and can therefore never earn God's favor or be saved. In 2001, a group of Muslims that have come to be known as Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for hijacking 4 planes and flying them into U.S. civilian and military targets. An estimated 3,000 people were killed, most of them in the World Trade Center in Manhattan, New York.
What's the root cause of terrorism? I have thought long and hard about this, and I think there are many examples one can think of in which one has seen that the root cause of a terrorist act has a political objective which perhaps many people will sympathize with. And it's always a very difficult issue separating out what the underlying rationale and purpose of the act is, and then how the struggle is carried out.
The kind of terrorism that we're seeing today, I believe, is often a response to oppression. People are responding to feeling being oppressed, and one of the things people do when they get oppressed is they feel closed down. At some point, you get this explosion, this boiling over of anger, feelings of injustice, feeling of being not part of the larger group, and they act out. And since they can't defeat it by itself, they oftentimes use terrorist acts.
Terrorism is a form of violence, much like cancer, in that it comes in many, many different forms. And we know we have lung cancers, we have blood cancers, we have skin cancers, and they're not all caused by the same things, and they don't affect the same individuals the same way. So why would we think, if all cancer doesn't have a single cause, why would we think terrorism has a single cause? Well, I don't. And so I studied the most virulent form of terrorism, suicide terrorism. Suicide terrorism kills more people than any other form of terrorism, much like lung cancer kills more people than any other form of cancer. And suicide terrorism also has a specific risk factor associated with it, much like lung cancer. In the case of lung cancer, it's smoking. In the case of suicide terrorism, it's foreign occupation. Foreign occupation, more than religion, more than poverty, more than any other cause, is the leading risk factor in producing suicide terrorism.
While politicians have constantly promoted the notion that the root causes of terrorism are mainly ignorance and poverty, Dr. Robert Pape wrote in his book, Dying to Win, that over 95% of suicide bombings throughout the world had the same strategic objective, and that is to compel foreign forces to withdrawing from their country. The book is essential academic research on suicide bombings. Dr. Pape established that the probability of having a suicide bomber amongst any people increases 11 times over if their country falls under foreign occupation.
Very often, if you dig away at the root causes of areas and parts of the world where violent conflict has erupted, where terrorist activity has taken place, and it goes back to time immemorial, one sees at the heart of this very often issues not just of poverty, most likely, in my view, not of ignorance, but of a sense also of injustice at some wrong that has been done and that is continuing over time, that is not being addressed.
In my opinion, it's injustice, humiliation, oppression that are the most common causes of terrorism.
Some people claim that religion motivates terrorists. However, the academic research of Dr. Robert Pape has proved the claim to be false.
What I did is I collected the first complete database of every suicide terrorist attack around the world since 1980. The first version of this database was published a few years ago, and it went from 1980 to 2003. Think of that as like the pre-Iraq database. And then the second version from 2004 on, think of that as the data that's happened since Iraq. And what the data shows quite clearly is that the principal cause of suicide terrorism is foreign occupation. In that period, from 1980 to 2003, there were 315 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. I don't mean attempts. These are people who actually killed themselves. The world leader during that 24-year period was not an Islamic group at all. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. In fact, over half of those 462 suicide attackers were purely secular, because you see many Muslim suicide terrorist groups are also purely secular, such as the PKK in Turkey. The PKK in Turkey, which did numerous suicide attacks in the 1990s, is again a Marxist, read anti-religious suicide terrorist group. Because you see, if Islam as sort of a radical religion, or if it were just radical Muslims doing this, then what you would expect is sort of this thin veneer of suicide attack kind of scattered all around the world. You would expect that, oh, there's 1.4 billion Muslims, you know, there's this teeny tiny fringe of Muslims kind of everywhere who'd be willing to do suicide attack, but that's not the way the data looks. It's really concentrated, and it's really concentrated in occupations.